I think it's a really, really good point, and kind of surprised to see a little bit of negativity around it, really, in terms of, I thought after the game a really, really good result for Liverpool, really, because I know there's a lot of talk around Arsenal's injury problems in the build-up, but obviously once you get Timber back in the side and Saka, who is clearly their best player, then, it didn't look too bad at all, really. You're only missing maybe Saliba and Odegaard out of what you would say was a nailed-on first 11, and Liverpool were going there without Jota and Alisson. One's the world's best keeper, and the other one would have been 100% starting at centre-forward. So the injury problems were pretty similar, really, that the two sides had. So and going to Arsenal away is extremely difficult. Liverpool know that as well as anyone. I mean, they lost on the last two occasions they've been there in the Premier League. They finished behind Arsenal for the last two seasons. So to go there and get a point, I think, is a really good result, particularly as it keeps Arsenal 4 points behind in the title race. I mean, it is really early days, but I think whenever you can open up a gap and you can keep that gap open, that's to be celebrated. And given how tight the title races have been in recent years, and I thought performance-wise as well, it wasn't a vintage Liverpool performance, but I thought on balance they were as good as Arsenal in the end. To be honest, I thought you look at all the statistics, the shots ends 9-all. I think shots on target are equal as well. Expected goals, so. It was an even game and kind of a game of two halves, really. Arsenal dominating the start, the first half, really, for large parts, and Liverpool being more in charge of the second. And, if you go to Arsenal away and you get an even game and take a point, I think that's to be celebrated. And I think a really, really good result for Liverpool, even if they weren't quite at their absolute best.
Yeah, I think on paper, it's definitely, in terms of the Premier League, Liverpool was probably second hardest game of the season they'll face after Man City away. So getting a point from that, if you come away from those two games with points, you're probably going to be in with a good shout for challenging for the title at the end of the season, aren't you? Because those are the two games most likely to drop points in. So to not lose those games, I think, is the big priority. To come away with a point, I think that's a good point for Liverpool. I don't think, it's not like Liverpool couldn't have gone there and won the game. I think that's not beyond Liverpool's capabilities, but to go there and get a point is definitely, it's got to be regarded as a better point for Liverpool than it is for Arsenal. What did you think of Arsenal's tactics in the second half? Because we saw it against Man City, didn't we? That was slightly different circumstances and fully understandable, I think, under those circumstances. 10 men down, with 10 men, 1 man down, away to Man City for a full half, really sitting back and defending deep. Wasn't to the same extent they did that against Liverpool, but there was definite drop-off, wasn't there? And I thought that was quite telling that they did that 11 versus 11. I know they had the injury problems with Saliba suspended and then Gabriel injured and Timber going off injured as well. But I thought it was quite telling that he chose to do that at home against Liverpool, 11 versus 11, as well as, the more understandable away against Man City one.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I mean, part of it, by the way, I feel was Liverpool were improving as well. I thought the setup in the second half was so much better in terms of when they moved Trent inside, he gave them that extra body there. And that's where Arsenal were dominating for so much of that first half. So I do think that had an influence in terms of how the game, the flow of the game, and Liverpool coming on a lot stronger. But I also agree that there was an element of Arsenal starting to sit back. And as you say, to do that at home. And you wonder whether Arteta is trying to get his players too much to kind of buy into this backs against the wall mentality and, everything kind of against us at the moment. And I think, he's done a fantastic job at Arsenal, don't get me wrong. And, I really don't want to go too far in my criticism because I think some people get tempted to do that at times. But he does tend towards the defensive, doesn't he? I think people took it as a real criticism of him that Jamie Carragher compared him to Jose Mourinho. But I mean, that comparison, if someone had said that 15 years ago, that comparison, you've been absolutely, as a manager, you've been over the moon to be compared to him. And what the point I think he was making was that, defense is sort of his first priority is to sit in and make things difficult and really try and shut teams out. And I think he tips towards that sometimes too early in games or just too frequently in terms of his whole idea around how a team should be set up. It just tends towards the negative. And I think, we've seen the sides that have dominated competitions in Europe recently, Real Madrid, they want games to be basketball games. Manchester City they defend, but they defend with the ball mostly, and they are primarily thinking of ways to cut you open with possession. And they're attack minded. you do kind of wonder if Arteta's defensive mentality and that being his main priority might just undermine them at times, and whether that is going to be, if you want to go and win the Premier League this season, even if you've got a few problems or whatever, the priority has got to be to attack, because a lot of the time you've got to get 90 odd points on board. So I just wonder whether his mentality will sometimes undermine Arsenal. And it's easy to say that now because they've had by their standards, a rough start, and they did really well over the last couple of seasons. So maybe I'm being a bit hasty, but that's just always been my one question mark over Arteta, is whether that defensive mindedness is just a little too much, and the scales are just imbalanced in favour of defensiveness, and whether that will cost them in the long run in terms of challenging for major honours. And I just thought we saw a little bit of evidence of that in the Liverpool game, because you can talk about injuries as well, but you look at Liverpool last season under Jurgen Klopp, the injuries they had, and the style of football and the wins that they got in that period when they had much worse injury problems. And sometimes it helps to just be a little bit more gung-ho, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly a different way to how Guardiola would approach it in the same scenario, isn't it? And obviously how Klopp would. Early signs suggest maybe different to how Slot would as well. So it is. I think you're right in saying the Mourinho comparison is almost seen as an insult now, whereas it used to be the highest praise you could give a manager. I think maybe that's because we're now living in the post-Guardiola world, where football has changed. Klopp obviously contributed to that as well a bit, but we're living in that world where Mourinho is now seen a little bit outdated, and the way to win titles is to win games rather than I think it was Ferguson who said championships are built on defense. And yeah, maybe Arteta is looking to do that mainly, and maybe that comes from the criticism for Arsenal for so long, was that they were too flaky, they were too weak, and they weren't robust enough in these big games in particular. And maybe he's gone a little bit too far the other direction, and I don't know if that will end up being a difference in the title race, but it's definitely an intriguing sort of difference between the three parts of the title race, isn't it?
Well, that's a perfect point actually about the Mourinho thing being seen as an insult as well. Is because part of that is is he seen as yesterday's man? Because as you say, we are in this Guardiola era where you have to get he's won a title with 100 points, and it's always got to be kind of a 90 or something around that. Whereas can Jose Mourinho football, or Mourinho at his peak, can that kind of football get you those points tallies? So maybe that is that is probably why it is seen as a little bit of an insult now. But I think but that doesn't stop it being a valid point, in that question is fair to ask. If you are so defense first and that's your mindset, is that going to be enough to get you those kind of 95 points that you maybe need to overhaul the Manchester City? Although I personally think it might be slightly less this season with some of the issues the top sides have. But yeah, that's the big question mark, and I think that's why people took offence at that comparison. But it's interesting because football has changed, and maybe Arteta will find that maybe he should be a little bit more open at times, a bit more throw caution to the wind, because that's what's needed to get enough points on the board.
Yeah, and I mean, to extend that point, it used to be that a draw against one of your title rivals was a pretty good result then, because City drop so few points nowadays, and under Guardiola, a draw is as bad as a defeat for so long now. So you can only really afford to drop points. As you say, maybe this season might be a bit different, but for a few seasons, you could only really afford to drop points in 3 or 4 games, 5 games a season, maybe max, and otherwise Man City would win the title, which is sort of a crazy level to get to. And maybe that's part of the reason why the Mourinho not necessarily going for the win and trying to protect the lead and taking the risks that come with that. And obviously Arsenal have now been stung twice late on, so it'd be quite interesting to see if Arteta persists with that.
Yeah, it's just something for him to think about, isn't it, in terms of whether, and he will, again, I'm sure he will point to the injuries and some of the problems they've had in terms of red cards as well as being massive mitigating factors. And I think particularly with the red cards, which just sometimes it just comes down to luck getting some of those, that is a factor, and something that's played a role in Arsenal's start being a little bit iffy and them not being able to hold on in the way that they maybe have done in the past. But it's something I think going forward now, and they've had this kind of rough start, they are going to have to kick on. They are going to have to do more in terms of dominating games, and they're going to have to pick up that ground that they've lost now, which is 4 points behind Liverpool, 5 behind Manchester City. They've got to work to do that. And the way you do that isn't so much maybe being solid, it's by going out there, taking risks and winning games. So, they've got that's for them, as you say. I think draws in the big games used to be more valuable. That's particularly true at home. I think for Liverpool it's not too bad a point because it's away from home, but for Arsenal it's a poor point really. So they've got to try and make that up elsewhere, and whether that's kind of winning a game late on in the 95th minute elsewhere, or really pushing to get a shock result at Manchester City or whatever, maybe rolling the dice a bit more is going to be the key for them.